see.
Okay, good. Okay. Hi everyone. My name is Minjae Kim, and my research forum project is about how art affects the brain. So, how does art affect it? Does art affect our brains? And my question is, if so, how? And my overall hypothesis is, I think art does significantly affect our brains, but I'm not exactly sure how yet. So that is my hypothesis. So art can be in many different forms, and these forms include paintings, sculptures, music, and so on. But today I'll be talking mainly about visual art, which includes things like paintings. So experiencing art is like, starting with making art includes things like drawing, sculpting, and like overall creating visuals. And experiencing art is mostly things like museums or like forums or these days like Instagram and Pinterest is all places where you can go and experience art for yourselves. So those are the two main ways people are like affected by art in the brain, and I'll be researching about that. So to start off, we have to ask the question, who makes art? And obviously, like everyone makes art, but if you think about it in an age demographic, you can see art being used like a lot in like kindergarten and like just around the preschool level. And I wonder like why? Because there is a reason why art is especially popular with younger children. And the answer is imagination. But why imagination? Like, how does this help us? So in the past, it might have been for survival, such as problem solving. And this might serve as an evolutionary purpose. There's also a theory that art making helps us navigate problems that might arise in the future. Our brain is a predictive machine. The brain uses information to make predictions about what we might do next, and more importantly, what we need to do to survive and thrive. But this is all about people thousands of years in the past, but this also applies to people today. And one way this applies to like people today is art therapy. So believe it or not, art can also be used as a means of therapy. And there was a study by a researcher that helped a student fight her depression using art. So the story basically goes like this. There's a researcher named Kaimal, and she was like a professor at Drexel University and a researcher in art therapy. So she met this girl and she was like really despaired. Her grades were really poor and she just had this sense of hopelessness. So since Kaimal is an art therapist, like using art to do therapy and research, she made the student take out a piece of paper and like color the whole sheet, and the student did so with a thick black marker. Kaimal didn't interrupt, she just let her do her thing. And then she looked at the black piece of paper and stared at it for some time. And then she was like, wow, that looks really dark and bleak. So the student herself admitted like what she just drew from her mind was like really dark. And that was like an accurate representation of what was actually happening in her mind. So then the student did something like rather particular like afterwards. She took out like some pink sculpting clay and like started making flowers, like which is like a direct contrast of what she like just made. And then she quotes, you know what? I think maybe this reminds me of spring, which is like kind of a big change in her overall like thinking process. And throughout this session and creating art, the student was able to imagine possibilities and see a future beyond the present moment in which she was despaired and depressed. So she looked beyond her current self and like at a more optimistic and happy future. This act of imagination is actually an act of survival. It is preparing us to imagine possibilities and hopefully survive those possibilities. These same traits is what enabled humans in thousands of years ago to survive and become one of the most successful species on the planet. And it is also helpful today for fighting things such as depression. For a lot of people, making art can be pretty nerve-wracking. Like a lot of people think, like, what are you gonna make? Like, what kind of materials am I gonna use? What if I can't do it? Like, what if it just sucks? Like, what if no one likes it? So studies show that despite these fears, engaging in any sort of visual expression results in the reward pathway in the brain being activated. This means that you feel good and it's perceived as a pleasurable experience. So a team of researchers in 2017 published a paper that measured blood flow to the brain's reward center. And what this is the medical prefrontal cortex. And in the study, participants were asked to color and doodle and just draw freely on blank sheets of papers. And indeed, the researchers did find that there was an increase in blood flow to this part of the brain, specifically when they were creating art. So this research suggests that making art may have benefit for people dealing with health conditions that activate the reward pathways in the brain. And these things can include things like addictive behaviors, like eating disorders, mood disorders, and it just really helps them. So there was a study that measured the cortisol levels of healthy adults. And for those of you that don't know, cortisol is a hormone that helps the body respond to stress. So in this study, they found that 45 minutes of creating art in a studio setting with an art therapist significantly lowered cortisol levels. Ultimately, making art should induce what the scientific community calls flow. And this is the thing that happens when you're in the zone. So you're losing sense of yourself and losing all awareness. You're so full in the moment and fully present that you forget all sense of space and time. So this happens when you're watching a movie or reading a book or playing a game or even creating art. So what is happening in your brain when you're in the flow state? So what happens is it activates several networks, including a relaxed reflective state, focused attention to task, and a sense of pleasure. And in more scientific terms, they found that the flow was characterized by increased theta wave activity in the frontal areas of the brain and moderate alpha wave activities in the frontal and central areas. So now we talked about one of the ways art affects our brain, which is creating it, but experiencing art is also a factor in affecting our brains. So we start off with pattern recognition. As you may know, a painting of a person is not really a person, and yet our brains are able to immediately recognize paint on a canvas made with lines and shading, and they just see it as a human being. It's very natural. In fact, our brains try to recognize faces in almost everything we see. So the brain is remarkably good at discerning familiarity and meaning from patterns, abstract forms, and incomplete information. Each time you're looking at a piece of art, your brain is working to make sense of the visual information it's receiving. From highly lifelike portraits to abstract collections of rectangles, looking at art stimulates the brain and puts our skill of organizing patterns and making sense of shapes to use. So a good example of this phenomenon is looking at a wall outlet that you have probably in your house. And if you look at it in a way, quick enough, you can actually see a surprised facial expression with the two prongs and the slightly bigger prong underneath. And people kind of just see it as a face. And that's one of the examples of how people are really good at recognizing patterns and putting that into use. So beyond the brain's skill at making sense of what we're seeing, the brain actually goes through changes when we look at a beautiful art piece. In fact, looking at a gorgeous painting, sculpture, or other artwork increases blood flow to the brain by as much as 10%, coincidentally the equivalent of looking at someone you love. Contrary to popular belief, creative thinking does not mean using the right side of your brain. So our brain has two hemispheres, the right and the left, and it actually involves using both hemispheres of your brain, and they will communicate with each other. As a result, art greatly enhances problem-solving skills. So there was a study that proved that field trips to art galleries and museums improve the critical thinking skills of students and children. This means that the greater exposure they have to works of art, the higher the rates of brain development is possible. So art also improves the attention to details, like the ability of the brain to perceive details. So to be able to explain like placing ourselves into the art, I first have to explain what embodied cognition is. So basically, it is when mirror neutrons in the brain turn things like action, movement, and energy you see in art into actual emotions you can feel. So all of this starts when you like first look at a piece of art. Because of embodied cognition, viewing art isn't just about making sense of the shapes. Rather, it is more about just thinking the art is beautiful and we want to place ourselves into the artwork. So a quick recap. There are two main ways of affecting our brains, and that is making art and experiencing art. Making art, so art can be used for therapy, and an example we saw earlier was that a researcher used art to help the depressed girl get better. Next up is the reward pathway. Feeling pleasure in art results in higher blood flow to the brain, and this was scientifically proven in a study as well. And then experiencing art. So now we're transitioning away from just creating art. So now we're experiencing it. We start off with pattern recognition. And as we discussed, it's like looking at a power outlet, recognizing people, faces, and patterns. And human brains can do this really well and incredibly fast. Next up, looking at beautiful art is another way that brings changes to the brain. So this is related to the reward pathways, and it's like really, really similar to looking at someone you love. So that just shows how powerful art is. And next, creative thinking. Unlike previously thought, looking at art and creating art uses both hemispheres of the brain, which greatly increases creative thinking. And next, being in the art. So looking at art actually like turns into like real emotions. And this can be seen like when you look at I'm sure everyone felt this at one point when you like are in a museum. You can like look at a piece of art and you kind of like just have a feeling about it. Like you can feel the amount of work the artist has put into it, and it's pretty cool. So, however, there was like one part I didn't know at the beginning, and this was the question, how does art affect our brains? And I now believe this research answered my question, and I hoped it answered the question for you as well. So as a result of my whole research, art does affect our brains, and as a result, my hypothesis was correct. Thank you for listening.